The afternoon shadows stretched long and jagged across the floorboards of the Harrington attic, crawling up the peeling wallpaper like the fingers of a secret no one dared to whisper. It was the kind of silence that didn't just indicate a lack of sound, but a presence, the heavy, airless weight of a life being lived in parentheses, the sort of golden, dusty light that seemed particularly suited to the keeping of prisoners who bore the names of daughters and the titles of heiresses, yet owned nothing but the air they breathed. Rose Harrington stood before the single barred window of her sanctuary, watching the world move on without her 3 stories below. At 20, she had grown accustomed to the particular rhythm of confinement, the quiet that settled over a soul when freedom had been folded away like a childhood toy, too dangerous to keep, too precious to remember. Her reflection in the dusty glass showed a woman of strained, ethereal paleness, with hair the color of midnight ink and eyes that held a restrained intensity, as if her entire being was a coiled spring waiting for a release that never came. Her features were composed, a mask of obedience she wore for the matron, but the set of her upright shoulders suggested a resolve that isolation had sharpened rather than broken. She was the sort of woman society had been told was fragile of mind, a ghost story told to explain her absence from ballrooms, a tragedy whispered about by relatives who preferred her inheritance to her company. Yet, unplumbed by the watchful eyes of her keepers, Rose had learned that the mind was the only place they couldn't reach, though the sanctuary of her thoughts was a lonely fortress. Behind her, the attic bore the unmistakable signs of a life restricted to a single room. The bed was narrow and the linen stiff. The small table held a single book with a spine cracked from 100 readings. The air was thick with the scent of old lavender and the matron's clinical disapproval. There were no mirrors here, save for the dark reflection in the window, for those who kept her believed that a woman who could not see herself would eventually forget she existed. The matron sat in the corner, her posture as rigid as the institutional rules she enforced. She had been the guardian of Rose's infirmity for 3 years, her eyes carrying the hollow, judgmental look of a woman who viewed her charge as a task to be managed rather than a human to be cared for. The surveillance was the beginning, the constant reminders of Rose's delicate nerves. Then came the locked doors, the intercepted letters, and the relatives who circled like patient vultures, waiting for the final commitment papers that would bury her alive in an asylum. "He is here," the matron said, her voice carrying the particular quality of a warning. "The Duke of Blackwood has arrived for the inspection." Rose did not turn from the window. She had heard the carriage wheels on the gravel, had felt the shift in the house's energy as if a predator had entered the garden. A duke required the settlement of an old family debt. A duke required a solution to a scandal of his own. A duke, particularly one as cold and commanding as Nathaniel Blackwood, might look into an attic and see not a madwoman, but an opportunity. "Will he open the door?" she asked, and her voice emerged with a quiet, lethal clarity. "He doesn't wait for doors to be opened," the matron replied, and Rose heard the heavy, purposeful thud of a nobleman's boots on the stairs, a sound that promised to shatter the silence of the attic forever. Behind every closed door is a diary waiting to be read. Welcome to Heiress Diaries with Manuscript. We drop a new perspective on power regularly. Subscribe and ensure you're always the first to hear the unthinkable. The heavy thud of boots against the attic stairs was a sound that didn't belong in Rose's world of hushed whispers and soft-soled slippers. It was a rhythmic masculine intrusion that made the very floorboards tremble. The matron stood abruptly, her hand flying to the heavy ring of keys at her waist, her face a mask of indignation that someone had dared to bypass the house's internal checkpoints. The door didn't just open, it was occupied. Duke Nathaniel Blackwood stood in the doorway, his tall frame nearly brushing the lintel, his dark coat absorbing what little light filtered through the single window. He didn't look like a man here for a social call. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield. His gaze swept the room with a cold, analytical speed, the narrow bed, the single book, and finally the small iron bars that had been crudely bolted across the window frame. Rose remained by the glass, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wore her long gray gloves, an accessory the matron insisted upon to hide the shameful trembling of her hands, though Rose knew the silk only served to remind her that she was not allowed to touch the world. "Duke Blackwood," the matron began, her voice brittle. "The Lady Rose is in a delicate state. Her nerves require absolute—" "Silence," Nathaniel interrupted. The word wasn't shouted, but it carried the weight of a physical blow. He walked toward Rose, his footsteps echoing with a terrifying finality. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He looked at the bars on the window, then down at her gloved hands. "They told me you were fragile, Lady Rose," Nathaniel said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "They told me your mind was a garden of weeds that needed to be walled off for your own protection." He reached out, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he caught the edge of her silk glove. He didn't pull, but the intent was clear. Rose felt a jolt of pure electricity at the contact, the first time a man's bare hand had touched her in years. "But I see no weeds here," he continued, his eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intensity that saw past the mask of obedience. "I see a woman who has been buried alive. Those bars aren't to keep the world out, are they? They are to keep you in." He turned back to the matron, his expression hardening into something truly lethal. "This is not a sick room. It is a cell, and I have no intention of settling a debt by leaving a Harrington asset in a cage." He looked back at Rose, the command in his posture softening into a silent promise. The decree had been made. He wasn't here to inspect her. He was here to claim her. For the first time in 3 years, the key to the attic wasn't held by the woman in the corner, but by the man standing in the center of the room. The descent from the attic felt like a slow-motion fall through a dream. Rose's legs, weakened by years of pacing a floor no larger than a rug, trembled beneath her gray silk skirts. Beside her, the Duke did not slow his stride, yet his hand remained a steady, immovable anchor around her own. He did not pull her, he led her, his presence forcing the very air of the house to rearrange itself around his authority. As they reached the first-floor landing, the silence of the house was replaced by the oppressive weight of 100 eyes. The Harrington staff had gathered in the foyer, a symmetrical line of dark blue uniforms against the cold white marble. These were the witnesses of her vanishing, the maids who had brought her trays of cold tea, the footmen who had stood guard at the bottom of the stairs, and the male attendants who had helped the matron enforce the quiet hours. They stood with their hands clasped and heads bowed, but their faces were neutral, watchful, and deeply judgmental. To them, Rose was not a lady being rescued. She was a scandal in motion. She could feel their suspicion like a physical heat, a collective doubt that she was sane enough to be standing on the threshold of the front door. At the base of the stairs stood her uncle, his face a mask of feigned concern that didn't quite reach his calculating eyes. "Nathaniel, surely you see the madness of this. She is in no fit state to—" "She is in no fit state to remain in a house that treats its blood like a burden." Nathaniel's voice cut through the foyer, hard as flint. He didn't stop to argue. He didn't even look at the man. The front doors swung open, and for the first time in 3 years, the scent of damp earth and horses hit Rose with the force of a tidal wave. The light of the overcast afternoon was blinding, turning the gravel drive into a sea of white fire. She faltered at the top of the stone steps, her breath hitching in a throat that had forgotten how to draw in the open air. The world was too large, too loud, too terrifyingly vast. Nathaniel stopped. He turned to her, blocking the view of the judging staff and the sneering uncle with the breadth of his shoulders. His grip on her hand tightened, firm and intentional. "Don't look at them, Rose," he commanded softly, his eyes the only stable thing in a spinning world. "Look at the carriage. Look at me. The threshold is the hardest part. Once you cross it, you are no longer the girl in the attic. You are my Duchess." Rose took a shuddering breath, her pale face composed but strained. She looked past the watchful witnesses and the rigid hierarchy of her old life. She looked at the dark, richly tailored coat of the man holding her hand, and stepped forward. As her boots hit the gravel, the sound of the heavy front doors closing behind her felt like the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. She had crossed the threshold of scandal, and there was no turning back. The journey to the Blackwood estate was a blur of spinning wheels and retreating landscapes, a dizzying transition from the suffocating attic to the vast, indifferent countryside. By the time the carriage rolled to a stop, the sun was sinking behind the jagged silhouette of a manor that looked more like a mountain of stone than a residence. Blackwood Hall was a fortress of dark granite and soaring spires, its many windows glinting like the eyes of a silent guardian against the encroaching dusk. As Rose stepped out, her legs felt like lead, the sheer scale of the estate making her feel even smaller than she had in her attic room. Nathaniel was at her side instantly, his presence a shield against the overwhelming space. He did not lead her to a service entrance or a side door. He marched her straight up the grand central steps, through doors of solid oak that swung open at his approach. The interior was a cathedral of shadows and scent, beeswax, old parchment, and the cold, clean air of the Highlands. Unlike the Harrington house, which had smelled of stagnant secrets and clinical discipline, this place felt alive with a heavy, ancient history. The staff here did not stand in judgmental lines. They moved with a quiet, efficient purpose, bowing deeply to Nathaniel and casting only fleeting, respectful glances at the woman on his arm. Nathaniel led her up a sweeping staircase to a suite of rooms in the east wing. He paused at the door, but he did not reach for the handle. Instead, he reached into his waistcoat and produced a heavy, ornate silver key. It was cool and solid when he pressed it into Rose's palm, his fingers lingering against hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "In this house, Rose, there are no bars on the windows, and there are no guards at your door. This key belongs to you. It is for your privacy, not your punishment." Rose looked down at the silver in her hand, the metal catching the amber light of the hall's sconces. For years, the sound of a key had been the herald of her isolation, the metallic click that severed her from the world. Now, the weight of it felt like a heavy, strange promise. "You may lock the door from the inside," he continued, his eyes searching hers with a blunt, honest intensity. "You may come and go as you please. You are a guest of the Blackwood lineage, and soon you will be its mistress. Here, you are not a patient to be managed. You are a woman who owns her own threshold." He stepped back, giving her space, a luxury she hadn't known in years. As she stepped into the room, she didn't hear the sound of a bolt sliding home behind her. Instead, she heard only the soft, receding thud of his boots on the carpet, leaving her alone in a room that was finally, terrifyingly, and beautifully her own. The dining room of Blackwood Hall was a cavern of flickering candlelight and deep shadows, the long mahogany table stretching between Rose and Nathaniel like a dark river. Rose sat at the far end, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of the silverware. For years, her meals had been a matter of prescription, bland broths and cold meats chosen by the matron to settle delicate nerves. She had forgotten that food could have a scent, or that a table could be anything other than a sight of silent endurance. Nathaniel sat at the head, the amber glow of the candelabra carving his features into sharp relief. He didn't begin to eat. Instead, he watched her with that same controlled, authoritative calm that had pulled her from the attic. A servant stood nearby, holding a heavy silver tray, but Nathaniel dismissed him with a subtle tilt of his head. "The chef has prepared 3 courses tonight, Rose," Nathaniel said, his voice a low resonance in the quiet room. A roasted venison with winter berries, a delicate sea bass in lemon butter, or a savory herb tart. He is waiting to know which you prefer. Rose hesitated, her breath hitching. Whatever is most convenient, Your Grace. I have no wish to be a burden. Convenience is for servants, and you are no burden, Nathaniel replied, his gaze unyielding. I am asking what you want, not what is expected and not what is easiest. I want to hear the sound of your own preference. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Rose looked at the empty plate, then at the man who was demanding she reclaim a piece of herself she thought had withered away. The sea bass, she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. A fine choice, he noted, his expression softening just a fraction. He didn't stop there. He gestured to a small stack of fabric swatches resting on a side table, silks, velvets, and wools, in shades of deep emerald, slate, and midnight. The dressmaker arrives tomorrow to replace those gray rags you were forced to wear. She will ask for your measurements, but I am asking for your color. Which of these speaks to the woman who walked out of the Harrington gates? Rose looked at the vibrant emerald, a color that reminded her of the moss on the trees she had watched from her barred window. It was bold, vivid, and entirely visible. The green, she said, her voice stronger this time, carrying a spark of the restrained intensity that had survived her confinement. Nathaniel leaned back, a ghost of a satisfied smile touching his lips. He wasn't just feeding her or clothing her, he was methodically dismantling the walls of her obedience. By forcing her to choose, he was forcing her to exist. As the sea bass was placed before her, the steam rising in fragrant curls, Rose realized that the most terrifying thing about the Duke wasn't his power, it was his insistence that she find her own. The library of Blackwood Hall was a cathedral of ancient dust and leather-bound secrets, where the towering oak shelves seemed to lean inward as if guarding the truth from the prying eyes of the present. Rose moved through the quiet aisles with the ghost-like grace of a woman who had spent years mastering the art of invisibility. The silver key Nathaniel had given her sat heavy in her pocket, a cold weight that reminded her she was no longer a prisoner. Yet the stillness of the room felt like a different kind of confinement, a labyrinth of history she had only just begun to navigate. She found herself in a secluded alcove, where the ledgers were bound in black hide, their spines embossed with the Harrington crest, alongside the Blackwood dragon. Her breath hitched. She pulled a heavy volume from the shelf, the parchment groaning as she opened it. The ink was faded, but her father's signature was unmistakable, bold, looping, and full of the confidence of a man who didn't know he was signing away his life. As she traced the lines of the transaction, the restrained intensity in her eyes flared into a cold realization. This wasn't a simple debt. These records dated back 10 years, long before the suspicious death of her parents. There were entries for shipments that never arrived, properties transferred under duress, and a series of loans that appeared more like a systematic dismantling of the Harrington estate than a business partnership. But it was the final entry that stopped her heart. A codicil, dated just weeks before her parents' carriage went over the cliff, mentioned a settlement of the soul involving the Harrington heir. The ink here was fresh, added recently in a sharp, authoritative hand she recognized all too well. Nathaniel's hand. The truth is rarely as tidy as a schoolgirl's story, Rose. She gasped, the ledger slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a hollow thud. Nathaniel stood in the shadow of the arched doorway, his posture controlled and his expression unreadable. He didn't look like the protector who had offered her a choice of sea bass and emerald silk. He looked like the man accustomed to social dominance, the architect of a plan she was only now beginning to see. "You knew?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the distrust that years of isolation had honed into a blade. "I was waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was being stolen," he corrected, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The debt your father owed wasn't just in gold, Rose, it was in blood, and your family was more than happy to pay it with yours. He walked toward her, and for the first time she didn't see an escape. She saw a man whose connection to her past was deeper and darker than she had ever imagined, leaving her to wonder if she had traded a cage for a dragon's hoard. The heavy silence of the library was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to count down the seconds of Rose's fading trust. She stood clutching the back of a velvet chair, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The man before her, the architect of her rescue, now felt like the most intricate part of her cage. Nathaniel did not move toward her. Instead, he walked to the far wall, where a portrait of the first Duke of Blackwood hung in gilded, oppressive splendor. "You look at me and see a man of absolute power, Rose," he began, his voice dropping to a low, hollow resonance. "You see the dark coat, the title, and the estate, but you don't see the price of the dragon's crest." He reached up, touching a hidden latch behind the portrait. With a groan of ancient hinges, a small recessed compartment swung open. Inside lay not gold or jewels, but a collection of weathered letters and a cracked porcelain doll, remnants of a childhood that had been dismantled as systematically as her own. "My attic was not a room at the top of a house," Nathaniel said, turning back to her. His composed mask finally slipped, revealing a raw, jagged vulnerability beneath. "It was the expectation of ice. From the moment I could walk, I was told that to lead was to be alone. My father took my sister's letters, burned my mother's music, and taught me that the only way to protect the Blackwood name was to become a ghost to my own heart." He walked closer now, stopping just outside the circle of light from the lamp. "I settled your father's debts because I knew what it felt like to be a piece on a board. I waited for the moment your relatives moved against you because I needed the legal right to interfere, the power to ensure that no one else could ever turn a key on you again." Rose watched him, the restrained intensity in her eyes shifting from fear to a profound, aching recognition. She saw the isolation in the set of his shoulders, a loneliness that matched the silence of her 3 years in the Harrington attic. He wasn't just her protector, he was her mirror. "You didn't just save me for the debt," she whispered, her voice finally steady. "I saved you because I was tired of being the only prisoner in this fortress," Nathaniel confessed, his hand reaching out, palm upward, a silent request rather than a command. "The secrets I kept were the only weapons I had to fight your family, but between us, Rose, there are no more locks." For the first time, Rose didn't look for an exit. She looked at the man who had built a kingdom out of shadows just to find someone who could survive them with him. She stepped forward, closing the distance, and placed her hand in his. The unlocking wasn't the sound of metal on metal. It was the quiet, terrifying shattering of two hearts finally allowing themselves to be seen. The fragile peace of Blackwood Hall was shattered by the arrival of a carriage bearing the Harrington crest, its wheels grinding against the gravel like teeth against bone. Rose stood at the top of the grand staircase, her fingers instinctively curling around the silver key in her pocket. Below, in the foyer, her uncle and the matron stood like dark stains against the pristine marble, flanked by 2 men whose heavy coats did not quite hide the bulk of iron shackles. "She is a ward of the Harrington estate, Duke," her uncle's voice rang out, slick with a feigned, oily authority. "We have the medical certificates. Her fragility has reached a breaking point, and we are here to ensure she is moved to a facility capable of managing her unique needs." Nathaniel did not move from the center of the hall. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture radiating a calm, terrifying dominance that seemed to drop the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. He didn't look at the certificates. He didn't look at the shackles. He only looked at the uncle, his eyes as cold as a winter sea. "You speak of property," Nathaniel said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "You forget that in this house, the only law that matters is mine, and the law of the Blackwood lineage is quite clear on the matter of the Duchess-elect." The matron stepped forward, her rigid posture trembling with indignation. "The girl belongs in the attic. She is a danger to herself and to your reputation, Your Grace. Give her to us, and this scandal disappears." Rose began to descend the stairs, her emerald silk dress rustling like the leaves of a forest reclaiming its land. She didn't shrink. She didn't hide. She stood beside Nathaniel, her pale face composed, the restrained intensity in her gaze now a visible flame. "I am not a scandal," Rose said, her voice clear and unwavering, echoing off the high-arched ceilings. Nathaniel placed a firm, intentional hand on her shoulder, a gesture of absolute protection. He looked at the uncle, his expression hardening into a mask of pure aristocratic steel. "If you step 1 inch closer to her, I will not only have you removed from my lands, I will open the ledgers I found in my library. I will show the crown exactly how the Harrington fortune vanished and where the blood on your hands came from." The uncle went pale, the medical papers fluttering in his trembling grip. The threat was not just a warning, it was a death sentence for his social standing. Nathaniel signaled to his own guards, tall, silent men in dark blue who moved with the lethal grace of shadows. "Leave," Nathaniel commanded, "and know this. From this day forward, Rose Harrington does not exist to you. There is only the Duchess of Blackwood, and I protect what is mine with the ferocity you cannot begin to imagine." As the Harringtons retreated into the gray afternoon, defeated by the man who had turned their own games against them, Rose felt the last of her chains dissolve. The standoff was over, and the fortress was finally secure. The ballroom of the Winter Gala was a shimmering sea of silk and gaslight, a place where the air tasted of expensive perfume and sharp gossip. For Rose, the vast room felt like a different kind of attic, one where the bars were made of social etiquette and the matron surveillance had been replaced by the collective gaze of 1,000 judgmental eyes. As she stood at the top of the grand stairs, her arm linked with Nathaniel's, she felt the rigid hierarchy of the ton bracing itself against her arrival. She wore the emerald silk, a bold, defiant statement against the drab, gray memory of her confinement. Beside her, Nathaniel was a pillar of dark, authoritative power, his hand firm over hers as they descended into the den of wolves. The whispers followed them like a trailing wake. They spoke of the mad Harrington girl and the Duke's sudden whim, their words designed to test the strength of her composure. "Keep your head high, Rose," Nathaniel murmured, his voice a steady anchor in the swirling noise. "They're looking for the ghost. Show them the Duchess." The consultation came near the refreshment table, where a circle of influential matrons and aging lords stood like self-appointed judges. Her uncle was there, lurking on the periphery, his eyes darting toward her with a desperate, malicious hope. Lady Danbury, a woman whose word could make or break a reputation, stepped forward, her fan clicking shut with a sound like a pistol shot. "Lady Rose," the elder woman drawled, her eyes scanning Rose's face for a hint of the fragility her relatives had publicized. "We have heard such concerning rumors regarding your health. Some say you were quite unable to face the light of day." Rose did not shrink. She met the woman's gaze with a clear, unwavering intensity that suggested depth unplumbed by their shallow observations. "The darkness I faced was not of my own making, my lady," Rose replied, her voice winning out with a terrifyingly sane clarity. "It is easy for a family to hide a daughter when they wish to inherit the son she stands in. A shocked silence rippled through the circle. Beside her, Nathaniel's grip tightened in a silent signal of pride. Rose turned her gaze directly to her uncle, who paled under the scrutiny of the room's elite. "I was not sick," Rose continued, her posture a masterpiece of quiet dignity. "I was a witness to a debt that some preferred I forget, but as you can see, my memory is quite intact, and I believe the ledgers of my father's estates will prove far more fragile than my mind." The shift in the room was palpable. The witnesses, once watchful and judgmental, now looked at her uncle with a new, icy suspicion. By standing her ground within the very heart of the social hierarchy, Rose had done more than prove her sanity. She had turned the masquerade into an execution. She was no longer the girl trapped in the attic. She was the woman who had brought the attic's secrets into the light, and for the first time, society was forced to look. The morning that followed the winter gala was not gray or indifferent. It was a brilliant, biting gold. The scandal that had once threatened to bury Rose instead consumed her relatives. With the Duke's ledgers as the killing blow, the Harrington conspiracy had collapsed under the weight of its own greed, leaving Rose not only vindicated, but the sole mistress of her family's restored fortune. Nathaniel stood by the tall library windows, his back to the room. The authoritative silhouette that had once terrified her now seemed almost vulnerable in the morning light. On the desk lay a set of legal documents, the official dissolution of any claim the Harringtons had over her, and a deed that returned her parents' estate to her name. Beside them lay the silver key, polished and gleaming. "You are a woman of independent means now, Rose," Nathaniel said, his voice a low, rough vibration that didn't carry its usual command. He didn't turn to face her. "The carriage is ready. You have the funds, the name, and the legal standing to live anywhere in the world. You are no longer a ward, a prisoner, or a duchess-elect by necessity. You are free." Rose walked toward him, her emerald silk skirts whispering against the carpet. She didn't stop until she stood beside him, looking out at the vast Blackwood lands that no longer felt like a different kind of fortress. She looked at the silver key, then back at the man who had taught her that power was only as good as the person who shared it. "Freedom is a strange thing, Nathaniel," she said, her voice carrying a quiet, lethal clarity. "For years, I thought it meant being alone. I thought it meant the absence of locks. But I realized last night, standing in that ballroom, that I was only truly free because I knew you were standing behind me." She reached out, her hand finding his. This time, she didn't wait for him to lead her. Her grip was firm, intentional, the touch of an equal. "I have spent my life being told where I must stay. For the first time, I want to choose where I remain. I don't want the Harrington house, and I don't want a life of genteel solitude." Nathaniel finally turned, his dark eyes searching hers with a desperate, silent hope. "And what do you want, Rose?" he whispered, the restrained intensity in her gaze now a steady, warming flame. "I want to stay here," she whispered, not as a fugitive seeking a sanctuary, but as the woman who owns her own threshold. "I want to be the Duchess of Blackwood because I love the dragon, not because I fear the wolves." Nathaniel didn't answer with words. He pulled her into the space between his heartbeats and the world, his embrace a promise of protection that no longer required a cage. The girl in the attic was gone, and in her place stood a woman who had found that the greatest freedom of all was the choice to never leave the side of the one who truly saw her. Some stories end, others follow you home. If this one did, subscribe. There's more waiting.